Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar on how to move your VDI workloads to public cloud. I'm very excited to have Marius Sandbu here with us, who's really going to share his experiences having done this for multiple clients throughout his career. Before I introduce Marius and we get started, I do want to go through some basic housekeeping. In terms of agenda today, Marius is really going to walk through what are some of those key drivers that are leading organizations to look at moving their workloads to the cloud. Talk about some of the scenarios he's seen in how they select which cloud to move to, and most importantly, how to avoid some common pitfalls that come up as you go through these different migrations. If you have questions, please submit them. We will respond either throughout, but we've got plenty of time at the end so that we can respond to them. And one question we always get is, will this recording be available? Yes, within 24 hours, you'll have this recording in your inbox. So let me go ahead and introduce Marius. For those that don't know Marius, he is a principal tech lead for cloud working at Evry in Norway. His primary focus these days are on cloud-based services as well as software-defined data center solutions. Many of you have probably heard him talk throughout his career at various CUGC, Microsoft, and VMware events. He has vast experience on that end-user computing side with VMware Horizon, Citrix Zen Desktop, Microsoft RDS, as well as cloud solutions like Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud, Amazon Web Services, EUC Cloud such as Citrix and Horizon Cloud, as well as strategic Office products such as Office 365 and Microsoft EMS. So with that, Marius, I want to welcome you to today's webinar with Goliath, and I'm going to turn it over to you for the rest of the time.
Thank you so much, Stacy. I also want to mention before I get started that if you have any follow-up questions afterwards, we also feel free to reach out to me directly on any social media platform that you can find me. I'm available on Twitter. You can send me an email or even LinkedIn. Now, as Stacy mentioned, I've been working a lot with public cloud for the last 10 years, specifically focusing on Microsoft Azure. But I feel that the last 2 years has been primarily focusing on building VDI or desktop as a service offerings from public cloud. So of course, a lot of the content that I'll be talking through today is a lot of the experiences that I've had from the latest projects that I've been doing, which of course we have a lot of existing on-premises customers now, which have been, I would say, forced through the pandemic to make some changes in how they enable their employees to access their desktops and applications. So of course, most of the customers that I've been working with have been on the left-hand side, having their own data centers, having VDI as a service provided from within the same data center, and they're trying to understand and explore in which direction they want to take. If they want to move to control plane as a service where the VDI provider is doing some form of management and providing us with functionality, but we still want to manage the VDI desktops and the other parts of the infrastructure. Or if you want to move to more of a desktop as a service where the VDI vendor is responsible for the entire platform, and we only provide them with a gold image with applications and some form of network connectivity. So of course, we've been working a lot with these two types of projects. And as I mentioned, the pandemic has also increased the cloud adoption rate. And of course, there's been different drivers for that cloud adoption, some of them being for innovation purposes, scalability, and also that customers and organizations now look at cloud as more an enabler for future businesses and new ways of providing applications and desktops. And of course, we're also seeing now that the VDI vendors are also changing direction with more focused on delivering VDI and desktop as a service offerings. So I'll also go through a little bit on what the different vendors are doing within this ecosystem. So I'll be talking about a little bit from the traditional or the shift from traditional VDI to public cloud, talk about some of the latest innovations that the different cloud providers and the different EUC compute vendors are doing within the ecosystem, how they integrate in terms of what kind of functionality they provide, what kind of preferred cloud platform do the VDI vendors have. I also go through a feature comparison between the different services. I also talk a little bit more in depth about the public cloud and what first steps you should do before you start building your VDI service on top of any cloud provider. So talking about the different building blocks that you have in place. And finally, going to some important considerations that you need to think about before you start building or moving services to the public cloud. So when I've been doing a lot of these projects with customers, of course, there's a lot of common questions that I typically get, because most of the customers, and just a small fun fact, since I'm based out of Norway, Norway is that country in the world which has the most Citrix licenses per resident. So there's a lot of large Citrix organizations here in Norway. So of course, they're now in the starting phases to figure out, okay, can we reuse our existing Citrix investments and move to the public cloud and use the same type of management tools, use the same type of technology, but on a public cloud provider? That's one of the common questions that I get. Another one is, okay, can we reuse existing management tools like monitoring tools that we have, which typically you look at a virtualization level, look at availability of our desktops and applications, or to make sure that we can reuse the same tools that we have in our toolbox, but against our cloud provider instead. So of course, these are a lot of the typical questions from an IT administrator perspective. But then of course, we have more the others want to understand, okay, can we provide the same experience for our end users if we move all our applications and services to the public cloud, or will something change? So of course, these are some of the most common questions. Of course, the most important thing that we also see is that, okay, how can I make sure that we have the same level of security if we move to public cloud? Because a lot of organizations have invested into third-party appliances, network security products. Can we reuse those within the cloud platform as well, or do we need to make some adjustments and changes? So these are some of the typical questions that I get when we start in a workshop or we start with a customer talking about their cloud journey. So we typically divide this into different building blocks. I'm just going to talk about this from a VDI perspective, but of course, cloud adoption is of course more than just the VDI service. It often also emphasizes on other parts of the infrastructure, the other applications, other parts of the infrastructure that you also need to move out to the public cloud. So we start by do a little bit more exploration. So giving them more understanding on different cloud providers, what kind of options they have in terms of cloud platforms and providers, look into how they should do management operations of their services in a future state. So of course, an outcome of the first, I would say, workshop or work stream is, okay, we want to look more into using Microsoft Azure in combination with WVD as a type of a future state. Then we typically do an assessment, and then it's figuring out, okay, what kind of tools and products do we have in our existing toolbox? Can we reuse like our backup service, or can we reuse our monitoring tools in a cloud-based state? And then we have, of course, the second part, which is knowledge and expertise. So does your organization have the necessary expertise to actually start building or migrating services to public cloud, or do we need to reskill or upskill the people in your IT organization to understand the different services that they will be using in a future state? So once we have a plan in place in terms of what kind of tooling, skills we need, then we typically start with building a secure foundation or a landing zone, if you will, which often contains how the network design should look like, how it's segmented into different subnets or security groups, how you control end user and also administrator access to the cloud platform, also determine what kind of security mechanisms that you should have in place to also meet any type of compliance demands that you might have, and also look into what other additional services you might need before you start building your services and applications on top of the cloud platform. And then we of course have the design in place as an outcome, and then we start doing an assessment of the existing infrastructure, looking into if we can migrate or if we need to rebuild existing services onto the public cloud. Also figuring out the financial aspect, so all these steps I'll go more through in detail afterwards, but from a financial aspect is looking into, okay, how much will it cost to actually run this specific workload in public cloud? A lot of the assessment tools that the cloud providers have will also give this type of overview once we do the assessment. So once the assessment is in place, then we define move groups or migration groups or what kind of services that we need to rebuild. And then we actually start doing the migration or building of the new services within the public cloud. And of course, it's the final phase, which is actually operating and managing the workloads that have been migrated. But I'll go through all these steps a little bit more in detail. First thing I want to start with is, as I mentioned, that a lot of the EUC vendors now are moving more towards fully desktop as a service offerings. So Citrix, it's one example. They've had Citrix Cloud now for the last 5 years. And Citrix Cloud has been focused on delivering a control plane as a service, saying that they can manage some of the core components, but you can still place your VDI desktops in your on-premises data center or within a specific cloud provider. And I think it was in 2019 or late 2019, they introduced something called Citrix Managed Desktops, which means that Citrix will deliver a fully managed desktop. You only provide them with an image, and then you just set up a network connection with your existing infrastructure. Microsoft is also moving towards the same type of delivery service. So they launched WVD for 1.5 years ago, which I'll talk to a little bit later. And they're also most likely coming with something called Cloud PC, which I'll talk to a little bit later, possibly this summer. VMware, on the other hand, has not been focusing too much on a fully desktop service, but I'll talk a little bit more about what they're actually doing and the new capabilities that have been launching the last 6 months a little bit later. So we've been looking through the different VDI delivery options. So of course, most of the customers that I've been working with, they have existing Citrix or VMware-based infrastructure. And they're now figuring out, okay, which direction do we want to take? We can use the control plane provider, control plane service from Citrix, VMware Horizon, or Windows Virtual Desktop, which means the providers will manage the core management components, so the gateway component, management sessions, licensing servers, and so on. We are still responsible for the VDI desktops, which has our applications installed. Of course, the problem with moving to like a control plane as a service means that we need to set up custom monitoring, because on one hand, we need to monitor the availability of our desktops and applications, but we also want to monitor the cloud provider or the EUC provider services as well. Because I want to make sure that if Citrix Cloud goes down, that I want to get notified directly instead of our end users giving me notification that something's not working. Then of course, I can also move to a fully managed desktop service where I say, okay, I don't want to focus on managing my desktops anymore. I want to move that responsibility over to a provider, but still, in most cases, we have applications that require connectivity to database servers or file servers or other middleware servers in between, which of course requires low latency connectivity. So it might not be feasible to move to a fully managed desktop service unless I have applications that can run directly without any integrations. So that, of course, is one important aspect to understand which direction that we want to take. And of course, want to understand the destination. Because when you're moving to public cloud, you're moving all the, let's say, high-end workloads to a public cloud provider. I just want to mention one example that we did for a customer in Norway, because we moved the workloads from an existing Citrix-based infrastructure to WVD in Azure. Now, when WVD was first released, the gateway components were only available in one of the Microsoft data centers in the US. So the connection between the end user in Norway went to the US and back again to the data center in West Europe. So we had close to 250 milliseconds latency on that connection. So that has since then been fixed because Microsoft is rolling out the gateway components on the other Azure data centers around the world, but we still are struggling a little bit between latency. This also applies for Citrix Cloud because they also have a gateway component that they also provide as part of their service. So it's important to understand the overall latency effect with moving your VDI workloads to public cloud. So of course, for Microsoft as an example, they have a virtual desktop experience estimator, which can calculate the latency from your end computer or your end user and to the closest Azure data center where they have Windows virtual desktop components. The second part is understanding the latency between the VDI desktop and other components or databases or integrations that it needs to communicate with. And another example, for the same customer that we're working on, we moved the infrastructure workloads, which a lot of legacy applications and had some dependencies to an Oracle database, which we moved to Microsoft data center in West Europe. So of course, before the migration, everything the customer had was placed within the same data center. So of course, there was pretty low latency connection between the desktops and the database. Once we moved the workload to the data center in West Europe, so the West Europe data center that Microsoft has is pretty large. I think it's close to 11 or 12 physical data centers. So of course, the distance between the desktops and the database actually got too large. So of course, it impacted the latency and also impacted the performance of this specific application. So of course, there are also mechanisms in the public cloud to make sure that you can group services to so close as possible within the same physical data center. Of course, this will also affect the availability, but then again, you need to compromise if you want to affect the performance or if you want to, or if it wants to affect the availability. When you're moving to public cloud, it's not just moving your workloads from one place to another, it's also investing into an ecosystem. So of course, there's a lot of different moving parts. And this chart just represents all the changes of the new announcements, new services that are happening from the different cloud providers throughout the last 5 years. So if you look at Microsoft Azure alone in 2019, there were close to 1,200 new changes. Of course, not all these changes will affect everyone because there's a lot of different services. But if we look at the trends, we see that this is not slowing down. So there will be coming more and more enhancements throughout the next couple of years. So we, of course, as a consumer or customer public cloud, we need to understand, okay, how will these new services affect my workloads? Of course, some new services or some new announcements can impact this from a financial aspect, that you can reduce the overall cost because there's coming new hardware or new infrastructure capabilities that we can use. Or new security mechanisms that we can use as well to increase our overall security. But this also means that the different, or depending on what kind of vendor that we choose, if we want to use Citrix or VMware Horizon on Azure, they also need to make a lot of changes and adjustments to actually make sure that their stuff won't break when Microsoft is introducing new capabilities. So it is, of course, important that we, if as an organization starting to move to public cloud, that we take note of what kind of new announcements, capabilities that the cloud providers actually are working on. Another part is that might also, so moving from a traditional based infrastructure, VDI infrastructure to public cloud might also make a lot of changes. So this is a summary of one of the customers that we're working on, which had the traditional VMware Citrix environment, had a lot of third-party appliances for security purposes, VPN, backup solutions. Of course, none of them could be reused in the public cloud. And also the customer said that, okay, their strategy was to use as much standardized services from the cloud provider as possible. So of course, the customer overall saved a lot of cost on third-party licenses, but again, they needed to focus a lot more on upskilling the organization to understand all of these new capabilities. So of course, overall, moving to a cloud-based environment can also make a lot of changes on your existing toolbox. So let's go a little bit more in depth and look at what kind of what the different EUC vendors are working on in terms of new innovation and new functionality, new features, because we want to make sure that you're choosing the right provider for the long run. Now, when it comes to Windows Virtual Desktop, which came out in late 2019, of course, it's gotten quite far already. Microsoft has been slowly introducing new capabilities, rolling out this service into more Azure regions. One thing they also introduced, and this is, of course, from an end user perspective, they introduced a new capability called Rdp Short Path. So by default, when an end user connects to a VDI session in Windows Virtual Desktop, it will go through the gateway component that Microsoft is responsible for. It also has a reverse TCP session enabled, so that means that the VDI desktops don't have a public IP or public-facing IP. But with Rdp Short Path, it means that the end user can directly connect to a VDI desktop running Windows Virtual Desktop. And it's also using UDP-based protocol, which also increases the performance and how it reacts to multimedia and other graphic-related applications. Microsoft is also working on making sure that as part of Windows Virtual Desktop, they introduce support for multi-session Windows 10. So one of the things that Microsoft is working heavily on is making sure that their management tools, such as Defender for Endpoint, Endpoint Manager, actually supports multi-session Windows 10. And Microsoft is also introducing their own monitoring capabilities as part of WVD, which is now included into Azure Monitor. But still, there's some functionality missed in terms of like troubleshooting, monitoring capabilities, because the Azure Monitor is essentially collecting a lot of logs and metrics from the WVD components. The last thing that I want to mention is, and this is something that is now in public preview, is something called Start on User Connect. Because by default, when you have virtual infrastructure running in public cloud, you're actually paying per second for the compute capacity that has been reserved for the specific VM. So with Start on User Connect, it means that when the end user is logging into the WVD portal, that user's specific VDI desktop would automatically start to boot within Azure. So that way we can save a lot of cost by not having the VDI desktop running at all times. I also want to mention that even though Microsoft has done a lot of great work in terms of introducing new capabilities in WVD, there's already a pretty big ecosystem in terms of third-party tools. And as an organization, if you want to invest in WVD, of course, a lot of organizations moving from Citrix are pretty known to using PVS or machine creation services to handle golden image management. This is not a functionality that WVD has by default. So of course, from a Microsoft perspective, they may say that, okay, you can use a lot of the other tools that they have. So Azure Image Builder or Azure Resource Manager to do automation. So you can either go the cloud native route, or you can use a third-party management tool to actually, let's say, hide away the complexity of Azure. Because there are already some third-party tools available that we can use there. And it's also a pretty big ecosystem from the community. So you have different scripts and tools in place that can also help you with ease of management. And also want to mention that Goliath also has something called WVD Assist, which can help out with troubleshooting and ease of management for WVD environments. And then I want to mention Cloud PC. As I said, WVD is focused on delivering the core components as a service, but we're still responsible for the VDI desktop. And with Cloud PC, it means that Microsoft will take full responsibility of the entire stack. Now, even though my image says otherwise on the right-hand side, this is a Windows 10 based only service. So Microsoft will only be providing Windows 10 desktops. It's going to be part of the Microsoft 365 ecosystem. It's going to be coming in different SKUs, determining on how much CPU and memory you want on your specific VMs or VDI desktop. And again, with other desktop as a service providers, we just provide Microsoft with an image which has our applications pre-installed and some form of network connectivity, either using VPN to connect your existing on-premises infrastructure or connection between existing Azure environments. Of course, the interesting thing is that this is not something that Microsoft has announced yet. There's been a lot of news articles and different publications, but we also look at the APIs that you're working on. So most likely this is something that's going to be announced during Microsoft Build at the end of May. And then we have Citrix Cloud. And of course, Citrix is also rolling out new capabilities. And one of the main things with Citrix is that they also provide support for all cloud providers. So they support, or the large cloud providers, so Microsoft, Google, and Amazon Web Services. But much of the capabilities that they're introducing now is much more aimed at much more functionality rich for Azure compared to the others. They've also made some introduced new services such as service continuity for Citrix Cloud, meaning that even though their control plane is down, the end users can still be able to access their desktops or applications. So they're working a lot on this front to make sure that even though they have issues, the desktop or the service from the end user perspective will still work. Another thing that I want to mention is that they're also moving away from the traditional Windows-based console, moving more into pure web-based UI, also making it easier to introduce new automation capabilities using the REST APIs. So that way you can automate the Citrix environment directly using the API or any type of automation tool that you might have. The last thing I want to mention is they've also introduced as part of Citrix Cloud, because before they only supported specific identity providers such as Okta and Azure Active Directory and NetScaler Gateway, but they also now introduce support for any type of identity provider as long as it supports the SAML protocol. So that way you can provide actually single sign-on directly from any end user if you have a SAML provider set up into Citrix Cloud into the VDI desktop. Now, when it comes to VMware Workspace ONE, I'm not sure if they changed the name lately, but I think that's the latest version, Horizon or VMware Horizon Cloud Workspace. Now, of course, they've also worked heavily on supporting public cloud, and they have also focused heavily on Microsoft Azure. They also now provide support for Azure Active Directory conditional access. They've introduced support for MSIX App Attach, which is Microsoft's new approach to providing virtualized applications. And it's also now going to be easy to manage through app volumes, which is VMware's layering capabilities. Now, VMware also has their managed control plane as a service. They don't provide the same type of gateway functionality that Citrix and Microsoft has. So they deploy a gateway service or virtual infrastructure gateway in your existing Azure infrastructure. They're also rolling out new capabilities constantly, but still not too focused on the full desktop as a service offering, but giving more flexibility and customization options to the customers instead of going into that specific route. Now, if we want to compare in terms of what kind of cloud providers are supported from different vendors, of course, Windows Virtual Desktop with Microsoft is only supported running on Azure. From a technical perspective, of course, it works on any cloud provider, but from a licensing perspective and other support issues, of course, Azure is the only supported platform. I also distinguish here on cloud native virtual machine infrastructure and also VMware based infrastructure, because all the cloud providers has a VMware based offering where you essentially get bare metal infrastructure running VMware within the cloud data center. Now, Citrix, on the other hand, supports all the cloud providers, both with provisioning, automatic scaling up and down of the VDI desktops. VMware has been focusing purely on Azure. They of course support the VMware-based offerings because essentially running traditionally as a VMware Cloud Foundation underneath. So they of course can provide the same type of provisioning that they would do in any traditional VMware-based environment. Now, in regards to like Google Cloud, for instance, they don't have their own VDI offering. Amazon Web Services, on the other hand, they have Amazon Workspaces, which is their VDI offering. And they also have a service called AppStream, which is focused on delivering remote applications. So overall, looking at what kind of highlight functions or highlighting some of the features of functionality different VDI vendors have. So of course, Windows Virtual Desktop focused on delivering a centralized control plane, focused on only Windows-based environments. So as of now, they have limited capabilities when it comes to monitoring and help desk tools. They support automatic start. and they don't have any built-in scaling mechanism. Of course, you can script it using other Azure native tools. They only support Azure Active Directory from an identity provider or ADFS if you have that as an option. And of course, Windows Virtual Desktop can only publish Windows applications as part of the web portal. So if you want to access any other or publish any web applications, you need to do this using other Microsoft Azure services such as Azure Active Directory directly, or Office 365 for that matter. Citrix Cloud, of course, provides a lot more functionality, both when it comes to the control plane, data plane, scaling up and down, supporting multiple operating systems. The same also applies for VMware. And of course, they have a much more feature-rich capabilities, both when it comes to troubleshooting, help desk tooling, and also when it comes to scaling. And of course, they support a lot more identity providers, providing full single sign-on into the actual desktop. And of course, looking at the protocol perspective as well, because I've been working a lot with optimizing the end user protocol to making sure that the end user gets the best performances possible. Of course, Citrix with HDX and VMware with Blast provides a much better end user experience with the traditional Windows Virtual Desktop reverse TCP connection. So now I just want to focus a little bit more on some of the main updates from different cloud providers and how they affect this, how they also impact from an end user perspective, and also any other cloud projects that I've been working on. So a lot of the customers that I've been working on are a lot in finance. So they, of course, have a lot of demands to comply with the PCI DSS standard. Of course, as part of that, also some requirements in terms of IPS and TLS-based inspection. Now, within Azure, they have a feature called Azure Firewall, which is a stateful firewall service, but it's been pretty basic in terms of other features up until now. They recently introduced something called Azure Firewall Premium, which now provides IPS, IDS, and also TLS inspection of traffic. Another thing that also Microsoft introduced is Microsoft Tunnel, which is a micro VPN service for mobile devices, so Android and iOS. And this is now working also in conjunction with Microsoft Defender, which is Microsoft's threat detection service, which is now the agent is bundled together with the Microsoft Tunnel agent for mobile devices. They've also introduced a new DLP engine, which is now working for Windows 10 endpoints. So that means that it can automatically classify and encrypt data which has any sensitive or secret information stored on any known format on a Windows 10 device. One other thing that we actually used a couple of weeks ago, because when we're moving a lot of application services to Azure, we need to test the applications to make sure that they're running as smooth as possible. So sometimes we need to make some changes to the underlying disk to make sure that the IOPS that the disk is giving us is not a bottleneck. So one of the new features that introduced is now that you can change the performance tier for SSD drives in Azure on the fly, just to see how it impacts the specific application. The last thing I want to mention is that within Azure, you have different file services that can use to actually replace existing file servers. So we have Azure Files, which is an SMB-based file service. And up until now, you haven't had any good backup mechanisms for taking backup of the data stored there, but Microsoft has an Azure native backup service, which now also supports Azure Files. When it comes to AWS and Google Cloud, of course, they announced a lot of new capabilities, but I'm purely focusing from an EUC perspective. So that's why the list is pretty short. But Amazon Web Services and with Workspaces, they've now introduced a new streaming protocol, which is more aimed at, so by default, Amazon Workspaces uses PC over IP. And then they introduced a new streaming protocol, which is aimed at users for high latency and high packet loss connections. So you can think of this new protocol similar to what Citrix had with FrameHawk. They've also introduced new authentication mechanisms. Now you can use smart card authentication for workspaces, or providing single sign-on indirectly, or any type of YubiKey authentication mechanism, for instance. For Google Cloud, of course, they've been working heavily with partners now, specifically with VMware, to provide zero trust-based access to their services. So that way you can use, for instance, VMware Carbon Black to provide zero trust-based access into services that are integrated with Google Cloud. So now I just want to mention some highlight features from the different cloud providers, just to give illustrate some of the differences and capabilities. Of course, much of the services that cloud providers have are quite similar, even though they have different names. But also in some cases, you might have existing workloads running on premises, which of course requires for let's say GPU support or GPU cards. Of course, the cloud providers, they also have a wide range of different GPU cards that they can provide, such as different AMD cards, NVIDIA cards. And also mentioned they have different services that can provide SMB-based storage, NFS-based storage. And they also have different disk sizes which can provide, of course, high bandwidth, high IOPS capacity. And of course, in addition, all the cloud providers as well also can have the option to set up VMware-based infrastructure as part of the same data center. So of course, if you want to do let's say a frictionless migration, you can of course set up a VMware-based infrastructure, move your workloads there, and you can start consuming other services within the same cloud provider as an alternative. When it comes to management, of course, all cloud platforms are built from the ground up with automation in mind. So we have an automation layer that you can use to build up your entire platform or infrastructure using something called infrastructure as code, which means that you can define your infrastructure state as code instead of clicking around in a portal. You have different security mechanisms or governance features in place. And one of the main things that we typically use this for is that I want to make sure that all services that I'm building in public cloud is only going to be placed within this specific data center region. So that way I can make sure that my developers or other parts of the organization are not setting up services in other regions, because that is the default setting, that you can actually go and set up services on any other regions that the cloud provider has, as long as you have access to the cloud provider. We also have different monitoring tools in place, but they are much more looking at the performance metrics, what are actually administrators doing in a specific cloud provider and what changes that are going on. They have pretty limited insight into actually what's going on within the specific VM or the processes or applications that are running inside. Last thing I want to mention is the advisory features. So by default, you can have there's actually two common advisory features. One is cost optimization. So if you have a lot of services set up in the public cloud, the advisory feature can give you recommendations on what you can do to actually reduce cost, such as, okay, you can buy reserved capacity. You can shut down virtual infrastructure that is no longer used. Second part is from a security perspective, saying that, okay, we can look at your overall architecture, design, what kind of features they're using, and give you as a customer recommendations what kind of services that you can use to actually reduce the overall risk and increase the security for your infrastructure. So moving on into that, of course, the cloud providers, they have a pretty vast list of services that you can use for your overall cloud platform. Of course, they have traditional firewall mechanisms, they have web-based firewall mechanisms, they have different DDoS protection services that you can use. They also have different services in place to encrypt data, because by default, all data is encrypted at rest, but you can also encrypt the specific VMs that you're running, and also to make sure that no one else that has access to the cloud platform is able to download any data that's stored there. And they also have built-in backup tools to actually do backup of the virtual infrastructure and other storage services that you might need. And they also have threat detection mechanisms that can monitor incoming and outbound traffic to any virtual infrastructure that might have running in public cloud. But of course, we need to use these services in combination with reference architecture that we should define. Of course, with that we have I call it a foundation, essentially a landing zone which defines how your network, your security should look like. And of course, without a need to start from scratch. All the cloud providers have a predefined landing zone that you can use. Of course, some of them are more detailed than others, and some of them also come with predefined scripts and templates that you can use. For instance, Microsoft introduced, I think it was last summer, they introduced Terraform-based template scripts and Azure DevOps-based scripts that you can use to actually deploy predefined best practices reference architecture. Now, different cloud providers, they also have other predefined architectures for different compliance purposes. So for PCI DSS, they have another template. So there's a pretty big list of different compliance architectures that they have. But of course, if you use one of these reference designs, you also want to make sure that you continuously evaluate based upon improvements that the vendors are deploying. So it might be that you deploy it once and then you need to incorporate any new changes, enhancements that the provider is building, so new services that they might be introducing over time. So once you have the foundation in place, then we need to look into, okay, how do we actually move the workloads to public cloud? And of course, there are three different main approaches when we're moving applications and services. We can, of course, do rehosting, essentially migrating the workload, migrating virtual machines from our existing on-premises infrastructure to the public cloud. And of course, the cloud provider, they have predefined services that you can use to actually help to do both the assessment and also do the migration. To actually do the migration of the virtual infrastructure. The second option is replatforming. Essentially, instead of moving the VM, I'm actually moving the workload. So instead of moving my SQL server, I can just move the SQL databases into a SQL service that the cloud provider has. The last option, and of course not always that relevant for a VDI perspective, is essentially, okay, instead of moving my application, I'm just going to build a new application using the cloud native services that the provider actually has. So we're going to focus now on the two last options, rehosting and replatforming, and which direction we can use. So when it comes to migrating virtual infrastructure, of course, assessment is a really important part of that puzzle. Now, the example that you see on the screen here is a screenshot from the Azure Migrate tool, which is a virtual appliance. It connects to your existing infrastructure physically and virtually. And then it looks into performance, what kind of hardware that's connected, and gives you an overall assessment of, okay, how many of these virtual machines, so these machines that you have, can be migrated to the public cloud. They also give you a size estimate, so what kind of t-shirt size that you could use in Azure, also what kind of disk size that you could use within Azure as well. They also will map any dependencies that the VM has, so any network connections outbound or any integrations with the database server or file server that it has, to also give you a good baseline of what kind of virtual machines that you should be migrating together, just to make sure that you don't have a lot of network traffic going back and forth between the cloud and your existing infrastructure. But you also want to make sure what kind of limitations that you're facing. Of course, there are workloads that are not possible to migrate because of OS architecture or specific hardware that you might have. The last thing is also what kind of network protocols that you're using. So if you have like traditional firewall appliances or load balancer appliances, they use a layer 2 network protocol feature to provide high availability, which is now not supported in any cloud provider. So that means that you need to rebuild. If you have like a checkpoint firewall cluster, you need to rebuild that in the public cloud using reference architecture that the vendor has. And another option is, of course, moving to a platform service. So instead of moving my Oracle workloads, I can then just use your Oracle RDS service from Amazon Web Services. So that way I don't need to manage the virtual infrastructure in the future state. Now, one of the things that we've encountered here is that we've done some of these workload migrations. So moving from an infrastructure to a platform service. But, and of course, from a technical perspective, it's worked just fine. But we've seen scenarios where the application vendor actually doesn't support moving to that specific platform. So of course, if you want to migrate services to platform services, reach out to application vendor first and ask if they actually support this specific platform before you start doing the migration. So once you're actually starting the migration phase as well, so we typically have a playbook in place to make sure that things will be running smoothly once everything is moved to the public cloud. So we have a typical 5-step approach. First off, we typically do a failover testing, so make sure that we replicate all the VMs to the public cloud. We start them up within an isolated or locked down network, so it's not going to affect the existing on-premises network. This is just to make sure that operating system is working as intended, disks and applications are working as intended, and also determine what kind of steps that we need to take to make sure that it's going to be connected to or integrated with the cloud provider. So some steps are typically removing other OS agents that we don't need, so backup tools, VMware agent tools, and also what kind of cloud-based agents that we need to install. So with this example, it would be typically installing the Azure agent. So once we have everything in place and we see that the application is running as intended, then we do a typical failover when we actually move workloads that are integrated, connected together. We shut down the on-premises server infrastructure. Then we continue on with actually testing the applications and services. So making sure that the connectivity is in place, the integrations, and then we of course verify the application. Then we go live with this specific move group. Then we of course repeat this process for the other work groups that we might have. But this is of course one way of doing migration for your existing infrastructure to the public cloud. When it comes to other considerations into public cloud, so I'm coming to the last part of my session now, but one thing that we have encountered many times is that not all cloud regions are equal. What I mean by that is that, let's say Microsoft data center in West Europe, which of course has all the Azure services that Microsoft has been releasing. However, that we saw that when Microsoft released the data center in Norway a couple of years ago, it only had a small subset of the same features. So that way we couldn't replicate the same architecture and the same set of services within that data center. So of course it's important to figure out, okay, if I am dependent on certain services, make sure that they are available in the other data centers as well. Plan compute capacity early. We have encountered issues where cloud providers suddenly ran out of CPU and memory, so we needed to wait another 6 months before we can actually do the migration workload. So of course, you can pre-allocate quotas within the cloud provider just by sending in a support ticket, just to make sure that you have enough capacity, so you're not paying for any capacity and just reserving the capacity for a future project. This also helps the cloud provider make sure that they have enough resources on their end. But just make sure that you do this early on before a project, just to make sure that the cloud provider will not run out, because that happens from time to time. Make sure that you have data and applications that belong together are moved together to the public cloud. So if you have applications running which require a low latency connection to the database, make sure that they're migrated together, so you don't have a lot of application traffic going back and forth between VPN connectivity or express route or direct connection that you might have. Also look into what the cloud provider has in terms of proximity services. So as the example that I mentioned earlier, looking into how you can place services or virtual infrastructure as close as possible within the cloud provider. The last thing I want to mention before I'm running out of time is that one of the things that we see from time to time is that, of course, we look into using a lot of the cloud-native monitoring tools, because they can give us a lot of insight on the different services that we use, but we also have an external monitoring tool which is running outside of the cloud provider, because we also want to make sure that if Microsoft or Google or Amazon goes down, I don't want to get notified from social media or Twitter that something's going on with Azure. I want to get notified directly from the monitoring tool. So having an outside view of things and having an external monitoring tool is, of course, also an important aspect when it comes to providing services or building services in the public cloud. So with that, I also think that Stacy, you had some final words before we go into the sessions, or the questions, I mean.
Yes, thank you, Marius, and thank you for such a great amount of information as well as shared experiences. We do have quite a few questions that have come in, so please keep them coming. But before we jump into questions, I did want to talk about one of the offerings that Goliath has. Many of you join our weekly webinar series, and you probably noticed this one was very different in that really leading with what does it take to migrate workloads. So we didn't talk about some of our software, but what I do want to make sure everyone's aware of is many of you know Goliath for offering our troubleshooting and monitoring software for end user experience, but we also have service offerings known as Goliath Care. And with Goliath Care, we can help you, guide you through many of the challenges that Marius spoke about in terms of if you're looking to do a health check and make sure that your infrastructure is ready for a migration, we can come in and assist and do that. If you're looking for someone to completely manage your entire new cloud infrastructure from the beginning to the end, we offer that not only as a remote offering for Citrix and Horizon, but also if you're looking for remote monitoring or SaaS or other administration, we have a complete offering there. And then if you are looking to overcome some of those challenges, we've been working with our clients. Many are in the situation, Marius, that you're describing, where they're identifying which workloads they're going to move first and where. And they really need the time just to do that. And so they're leveraging some of our project-based services to either help with the migrations, to upgrade, or even to troubleshoot and take off some of that end user experience challenges that they're facing today so they can focus on their goals. So I'd be happy if you go to the next slide, Marius. If you are interested in any of these Goliath Care offerings, or if you have questions around some of them, don't hesitate to email techinfo@goliathtechnologies.com. So with that, I do want to go ahead and jump into some of the questions. The first, Marius, is for you. It comes from John. He says, if my infrastructure/apps are going into one region, would it be best to keep all my user desktops in the same region or keep the desktops closer to the user regions?
Well, so that's a good question. And to be honest, it totally, well, we need to look at what's the overall latency from where the end users are and where the VDI desktops are going to be. So of course, if you are using, let's say, Citrix to provide virtual desktops from within a specific region, of course, they have a pretty good protocol to optimize from a large latency or high latency perspective. But of course, the important aspect is making sure that the VDI desktops and other parts of infrastructure that it needs to connect to are as close as possible. So I think that's the more important, that having those two grouped together instead of having the VDI desktops closer to the end users. Because I think that the user won't notice as much if they have a higher latency from the Citrix client to the desktop instead of having an application which has a high latency connection between the application and the backend database.
Great. And Nick just wanted to say thank you for the presentation, Marius. Was pleased.
Yeah, happy to hear.
This one actually comes for Goliath from Trey. Goliath, do you have experience migrating Citrix from an on-prem deployment to a public cloud like Azure? So absolutely. We have a number of clients that have decided to take their on-prem infrastructure and move it into a public cloud, and we've assisted that for them. We've also have clients, as I mentioned, where we manage that entire infrastructure. We also have clients that we've helped migrate to Citrix Cloud. So the answer is yes, we can absolutely support you in all those needs. The next comes from Richard. This is for you, Marius. Have you worked with an organization who has migrated off Citrix to WVD? And if so, were there any unexpected challenges that client faced?
Yes, we've actually done a couple of those migration projects now the last year. And primarily, it's been, the reason behind it is, of course, reducing the license cost for Citrix, and of course that they get WVD service for free from Microsoft as part of the existing licenses that they have. Of course, when we were doing the project, of course, the customer themselves, they have an existing IT organization that wanted to continue manage WVD within Azure. Of course, I think the biggest obstacle that we encountered was that we actually needed to do a lot of training for the customer to actually understand that, okay, how do we do image provisioning, image management in WVD? Because we looked into using the native services from Azure, so Azure Image Builder, to automate the deployment of an image, and also to make sure that if the customer gets a new version of some applications that they're building on their own, to make sure that it's automatically building a new version. So that's one of the first things that we worked heavily on. I think that was the biggest obstacle that we actually encountered. A second part was that, so this project, the project started early on when WVD was born, and the same ecosystem didn't exist then. Of course, the customer was running, I can't remember the brand, but they had a lot of thin clients which were not supported by WVD back then. I think that it's supported by them now, because they actually acquired some new thin clients at the same time. But also make sure that you have, like, was also say, look at the existing ecosystem that you have in terms of peripherals or any other connected devices or thin clients that you might have, to make sure that that specific vendor as well also supports WVD, because that was a big issue at the time. Besides that, of course, all of this is now running from the Azure data center in Norway. So other than those other obstacles, the customer now is just pretty happy with the new deployment.
That's great, and I think I echo some of the sentiments. We've had some clients make that transition, and one of the things we've seen is it's really come down to some of the tooling, such as the management and support. That's why, Marius, thank you for the shout out with WVD Assist. We do have a product that does help IT pros manage users, which means being able to remote into their session, send in messages, shadow their sessions, troubleshoot some issues, as well as set up new users. So if anyone's interested, don't hesitate to reach out to techinfo@goliathtechnologies.com and we can give you more details. Marius, next one comes from Sid, and I think we both could probably answer this, but I'll turn it over to you first. Sid wants to baseline performance metrics before and after a migration. What are the best metrics to look at?
So, we typically use a couple of common metrics. One is, of course, the overall latency and logon time for the end users logging into a new desktop. One of the things that we've struggled with, especially after doing a migration, is storage performance, because we have customers with a lot of existing SSD-based storage services. Of course, we've typically, or sometimes at least, we haven't calculated the IOPS boot storm or the IOPS logon storm once the end users are logging into the new cloud-based desktops. So of course, logon time, latency, and also making sure any type of disconnects are also logged. It's some of the typical metrics that we use.
Great, and to kind of step in there as well, and Marius, you and I were actually speaking about this as we prepared. One of the things I always encourage clients when you're thinking about baselining, and you talked about some specific metrics, and Sid asked about metrics, it's also thinking about that end user perspective. So one of the challenges that I see out there for a lot of IT pros is the tools they have today for baselining will often only look at individual IT elements. So you get a perspective of the infrastructure, but you're not actually getting a baseline for the end user experience from their perspective. And actually, Marius, I did put a slide in here, I think it's one or two after this. Oh, there you go. Where one of the things that Goliath offers is we actually have our end user experience scorecard. And many of our clients use this to baseline prior to a migration, so they get a full picture of what is the user's experience, looking at some of the key metrics you mentioned, but it's really looking at their speed, their logon, their connection, their network latency. All of these then give you a true perspective of that end user experience, so you don't have to infer it from individual IT elements or infrastructure pieces. So again, this is something that we can offer, and we even have migration as a service offering, so that if you're looking for help with migrations, you can leverage these reports in a 60, 90 day as you're going through the migration. So don't think that you have to buy a whole product to get access to some of these baseline metrics if you're in a project scenario. And Sid must like the report because he asked, how do we price our services? Well, Sid, I'm happy to share that. Really, it's dependent on the size of your infrastructure and what you're looking to do, right? We have such a range of services with Goliath Care, from helping do the work and allowing to shadow those users to doing everything for yourself. So definitely email in and we can talk about what that looks like. I will say we are very competitive when it comes to pricing around our services. We are a software company as well. That's where we spend a lot of our time. And so we do want to make sure that we have a price profile that makes it easy for clients like yourselves. We have another question for Goliath. This comes from Laurent. Before we move our infrastructure to the cloud, do you offer any health check services? So yes, and we do this for a number of our clients. We have a complete methodology where we will come in and do a health check, and we will really go ahead and ensure that your infrastructure, your security elements, everything is complying to best practices. And we encourage our clients to do this a lot. The last thing we want someone to do, and Marius, I bet you share the same with yours, is to take something that's not working 100% and try to move it to the cloud. You're going to fail. So make sure you get your house in order first, and we can help do that as an independent third party providing that health check. At the end of that check, you get a whole list of action items scored, and we're collaborating with you on those. But definitely get your house in order before you migrate. Moving infrastructure is not going to solve your problems. You need to make sure you solve those core problems before you make the infrastructure move. Any thoughts on that, Marius? I know you and I have talked about that as well.
Yeah, and I totally agree. Because we've seen so many moving parts fail when they're moving to public cloud, because for some reason they think that's going to solve everything by moving it to the cloud. And the second thing I just want to point out, the emphasis in terms of security, because one thing that and I also work a lot as a consultant, as an advisor, and I've been helping a lot of ransomware clients now the last 6 months, which have been where the ransomware started on a cloud-based infrastructure, because the customers were not fully understanding the different security mechanisms that the cloud provider actually had, and what was their responsibility, and what was the cloud provider's responsibility in those specific services that they were using.
Excellent point. This is the last question, unless we get any others, and I know we're running here a little over, but this is a great one. Actually, Marius, this is probably one you could spend another hour talking about. But this comes from Richard, and he asks, are organizations looking to migrate to the cloud? How are you seeing organizations leverage some of the new APIs to manage and automate workloads?
Yeah, so the typical customers that I have are, well, of course, they have the existing legacy applications that they need to move to a VDI-based environment. But of course, we also have new parts of the organization which are also working into more like a DevOps-based approach. So they're using the new tools, or a lot of them are using DevOps and GitHub and Terraform to actually build the entire infrastructure and other components that they're using. I've actually worked with a customer last week which is using DevOps as well to actually automate the data platform, or the data analytics platform as well. So, and I've also seen this discussion a couple of times talking with other IT administrators, IT professionals within the same ecosystem, that looking into using the DevOps methodology or way of working and tools that often are together with this is also going to be an important aspect moving forward. And moving to public cloud, it becomes much more core part of anything you do, doing everything as code, and leveraging those automation APIs that are part of the core element, or the core part of the cloud platform.
Perfect. Well, Marius, I really want to thank you again for joining us today. If anyone has questions, Marius was grateful enough to share his information that you can send to him, as well as at Goliath here, we have techinfo@goliathtechnologies.com. Really enjoyed the content, as I hope all of you did. There is a short survey, so when you close out, please take the 1 to 2 minutes and complete that survey. It really enables us to ensure we're constantly providing you the best information. And again, this recording will be in your inbox in the next 24 hours. Marius, I can't thank you enough, And I want to thank our audience today for joining and some great questions. I hope everyone has a great rest of their day. Goodbye.